Hello, welcome to this video in which we'll be taking a deeper look at our track Chilli Daddy. For those wondering, the track was named after our absolute favourite restaurant in Bristol, an inimitable source of Szechuan spice, the crown jewel of Chile, a mecca of mouth-watering deliciousness, the absolute unit of nutritious noodles. This track is our dedication to Chilli Daddy. The initial idea for Chilli Daddy was originally to make a kind of funk track using slap bass guitar and Rhodes. We wanted to make the bass guitar really front and center so that it was kind of driving the track both rhythmically and melodically with really catchy bass licks, which were then supported by the drums and the Rhodes. Around the time we wrote the track, Vulfpeck's The Beautiful Game album had just come out, and we were pretty inspired by their sound and especially the track Dean Town. We really liked how the guitar and Rhodes, and even the drums to a certain extent, are all following the groove and melody being played by the bass. So in order to establish a key and tempo for the track, we started out by recording a bunch of different chord progressions on the Rhodes at around 110, 115 BPM. From there, we went on to chop these up and began to create an initial idea. And this next project is really the first version of the track that we arrived at. And I'm just going to play this whole thing through so you can get a sense of where we started at. At this point, we left the project to sit for a while and didn't work on it for some time. And when we came back to it, we both felt like it wasn't really working that well. The idea felt sort of sluggish and not really that energetic. So we actually tried speeding it up to inject some more speed and dynamism. Instantly, we were reminded of the hecticness of some of Squarepusher's work, which we really liked. Once we sped up the tempo, we decided to basically recreate the track at 160 beats per minute instead of 115. And here are some of those really early ideas at the new tempo. So you can hear initially how they start out pretty similar to the previous project. And this is the final project file. The core of the track very much still revolves around the bass and the slap bass, which form a lot of the groove as well as the melody. One of the earliest elements that we worked on, which actually dictated the direction of the entire track, was some bass guitar that we'd previously recorded. Our friend James is a really great bass player, and we'd recorded him showing us various licks and slaps. As you can hear, there's loads of really cool stuff in here. Aside from some really sick licks, there's loads of cool sounds made from slapping the strings, which take on more of a percussive form. And the first step was to start chopping up the recording to make a melodic riff. A classic characteristic of slap bass is that it functions as a rhythmic and melodic element simultaneously. So we used a combination of the more obvious notes mixed in with some of the more percussive slaps and hits. The next step was taking this recording and beginning to process it. As you can hear right now, it's just dry, and it's really dynamic and also completely mono. So I just want to walk through this effects chain to analyze a bit about what each component is actually doing. So first up, we have a couple of compressors doing a really similar thing, basically reducing the dynamic range of the bass so that the louder parts are quieter, and then turning up the overall gain so that it's at a better level for further effects processing. The next group of effects is really the meat of the sound. And here we have 3 audio chains in parallel, each one serving a slightly different purpose. The first chain is essentially the dry signal. We're compressing it even further and boosting it once more, again to even out the range of the sound, as it's still fairly dynamic. We've also cut below around 100 Hz with an EQ, as everything below that is lower than the fundamental frequencies of the bass notes being played, so we can just discard that information. It's also good practice to cut around there when we know we'll be layering it with any kind of sub bass later on. The second chain contains some fairly extreme bit crushing and distortion, and this is being EQ'd again so that only the higher frequency is affected. And further down this chain, we have another chain with a flanger on it, a Ubic F, which is widening the sound so it becomes more stereo. This last chain is being run through an amp and then high passed again to give the overall sound more mid-range content. Layering differently processed chains like this together can really help to build a sound up and add a lot of character to something that might ordinarily sound quite plain. So altogether they sound like this. You might also notice here that this channel is clipping fairly hard, but this is okay for the time being. At this stage of the effects chain, we're focused mostly on just sculpting the sound, and we don't have to worry too much about clipping until it comes time to mixing the sound with the rest of the track. Next in the chain, we have another rack with a dry signal and also an instance of guitar rig with a auto filter effect. Auto filters essentially like a wah-wah pedal with an envelope follower on that responds to the dynamics of what's being fed into it. Wah-wah is a really classic effect on guitars, especially in funk records from the 70s, but it can also sound pretty good on the bass too. Next, we're applying a small amount of filtering followed by a multiband compressor, which is attenuating the gain of our high, mid and low frequency bands separately. The mids are quite overpowering at this stage, so we're compressing those harder to create a bit more space for the highs and the lows. Also notice that by doing this the signals become significantly less spiky and it's no longer clipping the meter. And now we have a pretty solid sound to base everything else around. This next rack has another flanger on it, affecting only the mid-range frequencies. Again, this is to create more width in the sound, and it's an effect that we use a lot on bass to act as a widening tool. We've automated the gain so that this extra stereo width only pops out at certain moments. And everything else in the chain essentially serves to add slight variation in the arrangement. For instance, there's a couple of reverbs that only come on at certain sections, as well as some gentle EQ. In addition to audio, we're also working in MIDI. Below this, we're using another bass guitar. This one's taken from a sample contact library, the Scarby J bass. And the notes pretty much follow the same sequence that the main bass guitar part is playing. Out of the box, this sound sits pretty far down in the frequency spectrum. Since we'll be adding sub-frequencies later, we've processed the sound to give it more character, again adding some guitar effects onto part of the sound. And so there's kind of a pattern emerging here, in that the fundamental dry signal remains largely unaffected, whilst we get more creative with effects processing on the mid and high frequency bands. Again, we have a flanger here, which splits the bass into a stereo signal. And finally, we high pass everything so that it's not conflicting with any of the other bass parts, and also so that there aren't any low frequencies in the side channels after we apply the flange. And the flanges are a really crucial effect here too. A lot of mixing is focused around the frequency spectrum only, and it's really important to remember that the stereo spectrum is another vital dimension that we have at our disposal in terms of giving sounds their own place and space in the mix. Without the flanger, you can hear how this bass guitar part gets lost a bit against the main bass part. Finally, for the bass guitar, we have another two channels that use the same bass recording again, although this time they're used much more as a rhythmic element, as we've picked out some of the more plucky percussive sounds to make really strong transients. Altogether, this is what the bass guitar part sounds like. Now, underneath all of this bass guitar sits the re-spaces, which occupy the sub-bass region of our mix. We're using a pretty simple Reese for this sound. Adding a pitch envelope to the transient makes the sound punchier, which is nice for the really short staccato notes. And the effects processing here is pretty simple. We have another 3-band frequency split, again following similar format to before. The first chain being the kind of the fundamental of the sound. Low pass, so we have a really solid sub-bass foundation that stays mono and also fairly constant in terms of loudness. You can also see how there's a bit of filter frequency automation here. It kind of follows the notes that the bass part is playing, so that when a higher note is being played, the filter is more open, and vice versa. The next two chains are to add some character and subtle distortion to the mid and high frequencies. And the MIDI notes here are pretty much the same as the main bass guitar part, but an octave down, which creates a really full sound when they're layered together with the other bass guitars. Lastly, we have a couple more layers down here which are adding some emphasis to the bass notes by accentuating the transients. And this channel, which contains some really distorted electric guitar from the East-West library that we then high pass to sit on top of everything else. So really there's quite a few channels here, but they're all mixed in such a way that they each have their respective space in the frequency spectrum and the stereo spectrum, which makes it much easier for them to bind together to form a cohesive whole. Next, we'll move on to take a look at the melodic and harmonic elements of the track. As I talked about earlier, the Rhodes part was sort of the beginning and genesis of the track, and we've used several layers to create different kinds of textures. The main chords are similar to the original 115 BPM idea, and they haven't changed that much. We've added some tremolo onto this part, which is a really classic effect on the Rhodes. Tremolo modulates the amplitude of a sound up and down, so it's loud and then quiet with a smooth transition in between. Stereo tremolo does the same thing, except that the left and right channels are both modulated independently and 180 degrees out of phase with one another, meaning that when the left channel is at its loudest, the right channel is at its quietest and vice versa. It's a really nice effect to create some stereo variation. The next Rhodes part is much stabbier, and it's sort of emulating the kind of chords that a keyboard player's left hand plays whilst the right hand is soloing, which is also known as comping. And we created these from one of the more rhythmic parts that I had recorded on the Rhodes. It's processed in a pretty similar fashion to the bass guitar that we saw earlier. We have some frequency splitting, some more tremolo, and another instance of guitar rig where we're adding some chorus and flanger to both the left and right channel and then panning them separately to create a really nice stereo effect. And again, some more auto wah. And again, some more flanger. This part below is also doing something similar. And next, there are a few reverse layers being fed into delays. And again, we're using Guitar Rig here and the tape echo, which is a pretty good emulation of the Roland Space Echoes. And I really love the sound of a reversed Rhodes, especially through a delay. It really accentuates the bell-like transients that the Rhodes has. These layers are really all to add background ambience and harmony to the main chords and the bass line. Further down in the project, we have a few instances of Contact again, this time with the Scarby Pianet library. The Pianet is an electromechanical instrument that's very similar to a Wurlitzer or a Rhodes in that it uses reeds as the sound generation source and pickups to amplify the reeds. I really like the sound of the Pianet, and it's not something we'd ever used before in our music. It sounds pretty good out of the box, but we've added some subtle processing on it to bring out some of the higher frequencies a little more. By itself, the Rhodes has a really strong fundamental and lovely presence in the low mids, but it doesn't have as much character in the higher frequencies as the Pianet does. So we're using the Pianet to sort of sit on top of the Rhodes. And here at the build-up, it's worth mentioning how simple these build-up chords actually are. All that we're actually doing here is taking this first chord, which is the root chord, in this case G minor, and then pitching it up incrementally to follow the G minor scale. So you can see how we've literally just pitched these notes up. And the bass part is doing the exact same thing, just ascending in the G minor scale. So yeah, we're using a few instances of the Pianet. Again with some tape echo. And when we get to the breakdown, we start to introduce the arpeggios. I think these were kind of inspired by Hiromi and some of her piano playing. So we've put the Pianet that we heard before pan to the right, and a MIDI piano sound pan to the left. And they're playing the exact same part, except one of them is shifted a beat, which sort of creates a Steve Reich type phasing effect. In the next section, there's a little bit of clavinet that we heard earlier. Again, clavinet, very much a staple of funk music, heard on all kinds of Motown records and especially Stevie Wonder. And actually this Contact library from Scarby comes with the Pianet too, so it's a nice thing to have, especially for anything funky. At the bridge, we start to introduce some variation with the bass and the keys outlining a new progression. It's really important to have some sort of evolution and progression in the track, especially if you want people to listen to the entire song. So we usually try and experiment with different arrangements and sections to keep the listener interested. And a really effective and easy way to do that is to work on creating a new chord progression. And you don't really have to know any music theory to do this either. It can be as simple as just moving some of the chords around and perhaps arranging them in a different order than they were before. This particular progression is relatively simple. We're centering it around the bass notes, which are playing the first 4 notes of the G minor scale in an escalating pattern. And everything on top is really an embellishment to add to this rising feeling. Finally, in this last section, we introduce another new chord progression. Again, this one is super simple too. All that we're doing is taking the root chord, a G minor, and adding a couple of extra notes on top to make it a G minor 9. And then we're literally just copying this chord across for the other 3 chords in the progression, except transposing it up and down like this. There's something about minor 9 chords that just lend themselves really well to creating interesting jazzy progressions, and transposing them up and down like this is almost a cheat way of doing it. You can really choose whatever notes you want and it'll sound kind of jazzy and interesting. And you can see that we've done the exact same thing with the Rhodes chord in audio. Finally, there's this last synth sound, which is just a diva preset that we've tweaked a little bit. And if I recall, this was partly inspired by some of Space Dimension Controller's tunes and his use of synths in particular. Turning up the glide parameter and then adding some lower notes and chords before the main melody creates a frenetic accenting effect and creates a lot of extra movement, making the melody feel more alive than if the notes aren't there. And lastly, a really simple operator saw pad with some very basic effects on to thicken the character. Let's move on to the drums. Because there's so much going on in the track rhythmically already, it was important that the main drums were super clean and punchy. They're also fairly simple rhythmically, just playing a simple half-time pattern. And like I mentioned before, the bass guitar is creating so much of the rhythm that the drum pattern can be really simple here. If we were to start adding more kicks and snares to the arrangement, it would probably start to feel too cluttered, especially since these main hits are so strong already. So in the main section at least, the kick and snare aren't layered with any other hits or foley or anything like that. We're just keeping them really nice and clean and fat. And sound selection is really important here. As you can see, there's no processing on this kick drum. So in this case, we're just using something that we've made already, which we know has the kind of body and punch to it that we want. And for the snare, there isn't that much processing either. We've added a small EQ boost around 250 Hz, which is purely to emphasize the fundamental frequency of the snare hit. And we've actually pitched this snare up a semitone as well, which can be a useful technique when mixing drums to help move the sound up or down the frequency spectrum and to find its own space in the mix. And it's also worth paying attention to the arrangement here too. The placement of the kick and the snare in particular in relation to all of the other elements is really crucial in terms of not only creating a coherent groove, but also can make the track much easier to mix too. If we mute this snare for a second, we can hear that there's basically nothing else in the entire track happening at the same time as the snare, except for a couple of ride cymbals. This can be really important in helping certain sounds to cut through the mix cleanly. I noticed that when we're listening to the track in real time, it doesn't sound like the snare's the only sound happening here. This isolated moment happens so quickly that our brain perceives it not just as an isolated moment, but instead as part of the context of the arrangement as a whole. So really all the space the snare requires to cut through the mix is just a fraction of a second for the transient before the other elements in the arrangement are reintroduced. As well as arrangement, sidechaining is a tool that we often use to help the main drum hits really cut through the mix. At the bottom of the drum group, we have a sidechain trigger set up, which is sending a signal to a bunch of compressors on some of the layers in the melodic group. Sidechain is set up to mimic the pattern that the kick and snare are playing. The aim of the sidechaining in this instance is to create headroom and space for the kick and snare hits by ducking the gain of certain other elements in the mix. In this project, we're using sidechain compressors on a lot of the louder melodic and bass elements to reduce their volume when the kick and snare are playing at the same time. Let's listen to the difference when the sidechain compressors are turned off. And back on. Back off. It's noticeably louder, as you can hear. And when we A/B that with the rest of the track, you can hear how the kick especially is punching through a lot more with the compressors turned on. And the aim isn't simply to sidechain everything to the kick and snare hits. Some elements in the mix won't need to be sidechained at all, maybe because they're background elements in the mix, or they're sustained sounds that don't have loud, sharp transients, or because they're sitting in a completely different part of the frequency spectrum to the main drum hits. As an example, these melodic elements in the second half aren't sidechained at all, because they don't need to be. They already have their own space in the mix and aren't masking the kick and snare at all. In this case, adding sidechain compression would actually be counterproductive. And back to the drums, in addition to the kick and snare, we'll also program some acoustic drums in Superior Drummer. For the purposes of this project, I rendered these parts to individual audio tracks for each part of the kit. These drums are really to support the main hits, like adding ghost notes for the snare and natural sounding ride cymbals to sit on top of the rest of the kit. They're also to add more energy to the drum part, as it sounds really sparse without the additional percussion. Next up in the breakdown, we have some filtered breaks with delay, again on a sort of square pusher jungle tip. These were made from chopping and layering a couple of sampled drum breaks and then resampling them to process further. So we have some simple filter automation. Basically to create a sweeping effect as well as moments of delay and glitchiness. And in this next section, the glitchiness is really ramped up and we have a load of different drum breaks and drum hits all happening at the same time. First up, we have this syncopated drum pattern that's been made from chopping up the kick and snare from a few different drum breaks. We've also really time stretched the kick out here to add to the glitch factor. Manipulating audio in this way, especially in Ableton, is really fun and easy, and the tones and textures warp modes especially can lead to some really interesting results. On top of this kick and snare pattern, we also start to add more detailed percussion. Down here, there's a KJ Sorka drum loop from a sample pack, which we've pitched up and then time stretched. So this is what it sounds like originally. And then pitched up and filtered and time stretched. And you can hear that we've compressed this really heavily. And the reason for that is we already have our main kick and snare hit, so we don't really need or want to hear the snappy transients in this break. So we've used the Ableton multiband tool, which means that in addition to compressing the loud parts of the break and lowering their volume, we're actually simultaneously raising the volume of the quiet parts of the break, expanding them, so that the tails of the cymbals and the hi-hats become louder and more elongated. The last thing I want to cover in this breakdown is just a little bit about the overall mix. As we often do, we have all of our elements divided into two groups, one for just the drums and percussion, and the other for everything else. It's obviously logical to have the drums and percussion in a group of their own, but why is everything else grouped together too? You would think logically it would also make sense to have the bass in a group of its own, maybe the Rhodes, and so on. And this could potentially be an option for mixing the track. Let's do an experiment though. I'm going to duplicate the bass and put it in a group of its own, separate from the rest of the melodic stuff, and instead routing it directly to the master output. And we will mirror the volume fader and the bus processing on the melodic group so that we can properly and accurately A/B between the two. Now let's have a quick A/B between them. It doesn't sound drastically different, but you might notice that the mix is now a little more dynamic, and some of these elements, the bass in particular, is actually a fair bit louder than they were before. And if we look at the signal coming to our master bus, we should be able to see that. And how it was originally. So yeah, you can see that when the bass is separate from the other elements, it's a couple of decibels louder, and the whole mix is slightly spikier or more dynamic. And this is where limiting can be really useful. In this instance, we're not limiting an isolated element, but instead we're limiting a whole group of things that all affect one another as they're being sent through the limiter all together at the same time. If there's a moment where the bass is really loud, then the limiter responds to that, reducing the volume of not only the bass, but also the other elements in the group to reduce the overall signal. And this way we can essentially use the limiter as a tool to balance everything a little bit better, so that the elements within the group don't cross a specific threshold, in this case around -12, 13. And ultimately that means we'll be able to mix these elements against the drums more easily, as they won't be quite so dynamic. So I really hope this breakdown has been useful and informative to you, and please let us know if there are any other tracks that you'd like us to cover. I know that the Zula from Polychrome is also very much requested, and I'm going to let Will cover that one soon as he recorded a lot of Foley in the track. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.